Good afternoon. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. Tonight's event is part of the Intermarium lecture series sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. This evening, we'll be hearing from Dr. Paul Kengor. Dr. Kengor is professor of political science at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and a New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books. He is senior director and chief academic fellow at the Institute for Faith and Freedom and former visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His articles have appeared in publications from the Washington Post and USA Today to the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. He is a longtime columnist and senior editor for the American Spectator. Dr. Kengor is an internationally recognized authority on, among other topics, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, communism, socialism, and conservatism. In August 2020, he released his latest book, The Devil and Karl Marx, which examines the chilling side of Marx and the Marxist revolution that still rages today. Dr. Kengor, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thanks, Hannah. Good to be with you, and always good to do anything with IWP, a place, an institution, an institute that I admire very much, and such great respect for John Lenchowski and all that he's done there. And so a shout out to him and my good friend Marek, and also folks like Ken DeGraffenried and others. So it's good to be back. Thanks. So I guess we have an hour here altogether, and so my subject is my book, The Devil and Karl Marx, and it's altogether, I turned in pretty long manuscript of about 140,000 words, and so this is a book that we put together about 400 pages altogether, and I say put together because it could have been a lot longer. And in fact, the editor of the book, published by Tan Books, was John Morehouse, and I gotta say very tragically, John died a couple weeks ago. It was very unexpected. It was a shock. He was only 51 years old, and died of a heart attack at home around his family, 5 young kids, his wife. Very sad, and so this is the first talk I've given on this book since John's death. So, but he did a remarkable job. And Tan Books is a Catholic publishing house. In fact, it's a joint group, Tan Books and St. Benedict Press. So this book is it's very Catholic. It's interesting. I got criticized in one of the negative reviews of the book. I didn't get many negative reviews. In fact, liberals just simply don't even review it. They don't even read it. I think I got a couple 1-star reviews at Amazon. One of those appeared within about a millisecond of the book being released live August 18th on Amazon, which showed that the person hadn't read it. But one of the reviewers was a reviewer from a young guy from National Review, and he criticized the book for having a limited appeal mainly to Catholics. And one of the things I pointed out in my response to that review at National Review was, I plead guilty. It's a very Catholic book. It's a Catholic publishing house. But it's much more than that. It's a biography of Karl Marx, a spiritual biography of Karl Marx. And why did I write this? Well, I wrote out a little bit of an outline here so you guys could follow along with me. Basically 5 points here. Why did I write this? Point 1. 2, what's my thesis? 3, is this book strictly about Marx? 4, the key issues that I hit in the book. And 5, why do we need to know this? Why do we need to know this topic? So I'll go through each of those 5 points and just talking off the top of my head. And then after that, I'll take any questions that you have. First of all, why did I write this? I've done spiritual biographies of a number of different figures, and really my first book was my dissertation, and that was on the subject of the vice presidency, published around 2000, 2001, Lexington Books with Roman Littlefield. And my first kind of real book was a book called God and Ronald Reagan, which came out in 2004. In fact, it was from that book that I would eventually meet John Lanchowski and so many others, especially through the person of Bill Clark. And Bill Clark was probably Ronald Reagan's closest friend and advisor. Really, the guy who was responsible for taking down Soviet communism more than any other member of the Reagan administration, and he did that at the NSC with people like John Lanchowski, Ken DeGraff and Reed. Boy, I'm forgetting some Roger Robinson, a number of other people, another number of people connected with IWP. So that was really my first book, and it was a spiritual biography, but also a foreign policy book. So God and Ronald Reagan. I followed that up. I did a book called God and George W. Bush. I even did a book called God and Hillary Clinton, which people always think I'm joking when I say that. No, it was an attempt to look at spiritually somebody from the political left, somebody from the religious left, not somebody who I supported or would have voted for, but nonetheless, I looked at her faith. And I got offers to do a number of different books over the years, spiritual biographies of people, and turned them all down. I didn't always want to do what my publisher at HarperCollins once called God and books. I even got asked to do God and Donald Trump in 2016, and I passed on that one. Somebody else ended up doing it, and I was more consumed with other projects than anything else. But I won't go into all of that. So I've always been interested in the spiritual life of Karl Marx, and so a book on that would not be called God and Karl Marx, because Marx didn't believe in God. Marx rejected God. In fact, as one of the poems that I quote at the start of the book says, and this poem was written by Marx in 1837. He said, "Thus heaven I've forfeited. I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell." It's pretty chilling. And a lot of the guy's poetry, verse, plays was pretty chilling. And it was, I think that particular, it's hard to know with Marx when he's speaking biographically, when he's speaking of autobiographically, when he's talking about himself, when he's putting himself in the place of others, when he's just writing about somebody else in the way that a poet would, or that a writer would. But that particular stanza, I mean, that is pretty autobiographical. Thus heaven I've forfeited, right? I know it full well. So Marx, who had once been a Christian, and he rejected that. And I wouldn't say, as a Catholic in particular, that Marx's soul was chosen for hell. I don't know if Marx felt his soul was chosen for hell, but that idea that heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well. Well, that was Marx, because he ended up rejecting God, and he was baptized in 1823, 1824, around the time that he was 5 or 6 years old. He was born May 5th, 1818, in Trier, Germany. So Trier is spelled like Trier, Trier, and it is a very religious city. In fact, the ancient cathedral in Trier is the one that was built by none other than Saint Helena, mother of Constantine. And it was Helena who made the pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the late 300s, so around 324, 330, 320 is that period we're talking about. And she went there and brought back a number of different relics, artifacts. In fact, it's more than relics and artifacts. She brought back what she believed was the crown of thorns, which is today in Notre Dame. She brought back what she believes was the Holy Lance, the lance that the Roman soldier pierced Christ with. She brought back, and this to this day is in the cathedral in Trier. She brought back the holy robe or holy coat that Christ had wore, and on his way to the crucifixion, that the Roman soldiers cast lots for at the foot of the cross. In fact, Marx, in one of his plays, one of his really chilling, sick, kind of scary plays, has his devil character, his demon character, who's like sawing on this violin. He dons this holy robe of Christ and this kind of mockery of Christ. Another poem that Marx wrote that I lead off in the front of the book with from 1841. He says, "See this sword, this blood dark sword, which stabs unerringly within thy soul. See this sword, the Prince of Darkness sold it to me." It's that kind of thing that pervades Marx's poetry, his writing. He's writing about pale maidens who commit suicide, some of them in suicide pacts. And a lot of this is a reflection of Marx's own personal life, including his really wretched family life. This is an amazing fact. I mean, name for me anybody listening, another individual that you could think of historically that this applies to. Marx lost two daughters to suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands. So Marx had two daughters who killed themselves in suicide pacts with their husbands. Marx wrote about pale maidens committing suicide. He wrote about suicide pacts. He wrote about women committing suicide by ingesting poison. Two of Marx's daughters committed suicide by ingesting poison given to them in suicide pacts by their husbands. In fact, in one case, the husband backed out. He gave the daughter the poison. She killed herself, and then he backed out. Edward Aveling, a scoundrel, awful guy, atheist, socialist. In fact, a lot like Marx, just a wretched person that no one liked. And contemporaries of Marx's daughter and Aveling thought that he should have been convicted for murder, for killing her, for homicide. And he ran off with her money, whatever inheritance she had, which was not much of an inheritance. The other son who did go through with a suicide pact with Marx's daughter, his name was Paul Lafarg, and he had very low self-esteem, and part of that is attributable to the way his father-in-law treated him. Paul was partly Cuban, so to Karl Marx that meant that he was partly Negro. In fact, Marx and Engels, they tried to deduce with scientific accuracy how much Negro blood is in Paul, 1/8, 1/12. Marx referred to Paul as Negrillo, or the gorilla, because he contained this, he had this Cuban blood. And this is something that I hit in this book. Marx and Engels were both racists. They were bigots. And Marx was very anti-Semitic. I mean, some of the statements from Marx, quote, "The Israelite faith is repulsive to me," right? "What is the worldly God of the Jew? Money, haggling," right? Marx writes some amazingly anti-Semitic stuff. If Karl Marx was a conservative, a right-winger, somebody that conservatives today liked, a person who conservative professors had busts of Marx in their offices at their colleges, Marx would be canceled. Marx would be finished. He would be widely known everywhere as a racist, but he's not widely known as a racist. He's not known as a racist, as an anti-Semite, or bigot at all, because he's a leftist. and leftists protect him. That's all there is to it. I always say, in fact, I suggested this to Young America's Foundation, that a campaign should be started by college students to cancel Marx, making the case that Marx was a racist. I mean, they're trying to dename things named for Ronald Reagan because of one statement that Reagan made to Nixon in a private phone call in 1972 that just came out a few months ago. I've written about this for American Spectator. By the way, I'm at the offices of the American Spectator. So if you look behind me there's Bob Terrell with Bill Clinton and a copy of the American Spectator. So if you see that, that's where I am right now. But I wrote about this attempt to cancel Reagan for something Reagan said that's hard to understand, hard to make sense out of, hard to really know what Reagan meant. Definitely seems insensitive, totally out of character for Reagan, but frankly is nothing compared to what Marx said many, 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 many times. Irony there, and this gets back to point one on why I chose Marx. So Marx was from a Jewish family, a family that had a number of rabbis in the previous generations. They were religious Jews. They were practicing Jews. fairly orthodox. Marx's father converted to Christianity. He converted to Lutheranism, and so did Marx as well. And I talk about the relationship between the father and the son quite a bit in the book. The father remained a religious man and even told Karl, he said, it's good, Karl, to have belief in God. Belief in God, it's a virtuous thing. It's good for a man. It's good for a person to have that. But Marx would go on to reject God, mainly in college. In fact, he came under the influence of a religion professor who was an atheist. So you can see nothing has changed, right? You go to most universities today, and you could take a religion course. It's probably taught by an atheist. Not where I teach at Grove City College. Somebody who goes to my church has their son went to a typical secular university, and I was talking to the parents, and I was worried about the kid's faith, and they told me, said, oh, it's okay, he signed up for a course on religion his first semester. I'm thinking, I asked them around Thanksgiving or Christmas break, how's it going? And they said, oh, it's terribly liberal. And the religion course, it's taught by an atheist. Well, of course it is. We think it's taught by C.S. Lewis. Of course it's taught by an atheist. So even in Germany in the 1830s, Marx took a course there's like a systematic theology course taught by an atheist. And the professor's name was Bruno Bauer, who was very anti-Semitic. And he and his favorite student, Karl, would even launch an Archives of Atheism journal together, which didn't last very long. In fact, one of their escapades, they get together and they ride donkeys into a nearby village on Palm Sunday, mocking the entrance of Christ into Jerusalem. So that was typical. I see something popping up there. I want to make sure I'm still connected. So why did I write this point one here in my little outline? I've always been interested in the faith of Marx, Marx and religion, Marx's rejection of God, what Marx believed, his faith. I wasn't going to call this book that God and Karl Marx. And I've always known about Marx's fascination with the devil. Now, to that end, point two, what's my thesis? Well, it's not this. I have not found any evidence that Karl Marx was possessed, that he was a Satanist, right? And I always tell people, and young people in particular that are watching this, you never want to overstate things with your research, but also you don't want to understate. And I've seen many times where people will say, well, you don't have proof here that the guy was a Satan worshiper. Just forget this. Well, I mean, you don't have to have the whole enchilada here. All right. You look at the guy's poetry and other stuff and things the guy wrote. This is a very disturbing portrait. All right. I mean, the guy doesn't have to be full demonic possession or anything, right? But this is pretty dark. There's some very, very shady stuff going on here. I do quote some people who think that maybe Marx was possessed, and one of them, Robert Payne, a British man of letters, a British professor of. He was a translator. He read plays, a playwright himself, I believe. Very thoughtful individual, and he wrote two outstanding biographies of Marx. In fact, I think he wrote more than two, but one was published by Simon and Schuster in 1968. I still think it's the best biography of Marx. Another by NYU Press. That was a few years later. And in the 1968 Simon and Schuster book, he has a chapter called The Demons, where he says in there that he believes that Marx might well have been possessed. Let me see if I can get the exact quote here from you, because I don't want to misrepresent this. Here it is. This is an exact quote from Payne. The Demons. That's the 1960. The name of the chapter in his 1968 biography. Quote: "There were times when Marx seemed to be possessed by demons. Marx had the devil's view of the world, and he had the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know that he was accomplishing works of evil." So that's Payne. Payne actually writes that. Now, another who says this is actually who goes even further is the late Reverend Richard Wormbraun, who wrote the book Tortured for Christ, and he had been tortured in communist prisons in Romania, and he said he was tortured by men who literally chanted, "I am the devil, I am the devil." And Warren Braun even said to one of his captors at one point, he's like, "Why are you doing this? Why are you so vicious? Why are you so cruel?" And the communist captor or his prison guard said to him, I've lived all my life for this moment when I can express all the evil in my heart against you." And Warren Braun said, he said that I had people torturing me who shouted, "I am the devil." He said, all the scenes in Dante's Inferno cannot begin to compare to the hell of what life was like in communist prison camps and what they did to religious prisoners. And in Tortured for Christ, Wormbraun even said that there were some scenes from the prison of Pitesti that were so vile and so cruel and so diabolical and so indeed truly satanic that he can't even repeat them because his heart would break from talking about them. Now, he wrote that, Wormbraun did, Tortured for Christ, over 40 years ago. Wormbraun also did a book called Marx and Satan in the 1980s, where he argues that he thought that Marx was a Satanist. And I say in my book, I can't confirm that. I don't know, just like I can't confirm whether or not the guy was possessed. But in Tortured for Christ, Wormbraun said some of the scenes from the prison in Pitesti in Romania were so vile and wretched that I can't even repeat them. We now know from interviews that have been done, documents that are now out there. There's an amazing website. In fact, I quote this. I have a whole chapter called "The Hell That Was Pitesti" in this book. This book, over 400 pages, about a third of it is about Karl Marx. The rest is about communism generally, including other people, Mikhail Bakunin, Saul Alinsky, Kate Millett, who was called the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. She wrote the book Sexual Politics, which was her dissertation at Columbia in late 1960s. I interviewed Kate's sister, Mallory, at length. Mallory believes that Kate was actually possessed. Frankfurt School people, Wilhelm Reich, Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin was into some really weird stuff. But anyway, Pitesti. We now know that Pitesti, some of the things that Wormbraun couldn't speak of, couldn't write of. They were tying religious prisoners to crosses. They were making other religious prisoners go up and urinate on these people. They took pastors and they forced them to consecrate human excrement in the form of communion wafers and put them in people's mouths as like mock communion. They would take urine and put it in a chalice that was to be used as the blood of Christ. Christ was called the great idiot crucified. The Blessed Mother was called the great whore. This was stuff that happened in the prison of Pitesti. And yes, in the prison of Pitesti, there were black masses that went on. So even this book, as I say in the beginning, probably should be called less The Devil and Karl Marx than The Devil and Communism, because I go into all of this stuff across the board on communism. And the hardest thing about writing this book was limiting it to 140,000 words. I mean, to really talk about the true evil and diabolical nature of communism would be multi-volumes, right? It would take much more than that. So point 3, is this book strictly about Marx? No, it's not. And I go through too some of the counter response to this, including, and here's the very Catholic part of the book. One of the reasons that John Morehouse and Tan Books was so interested in this. And I first saw this when I was not Catholic. In fact, wasn't even a Christian at that point, and saw it even more when I was Protestant, Presbyterian. As I became a Christian, started reading more and more about this. But the Catholic Church's response to the diabolical aspects of communism is really extraordinary. It's an amazing thing, and it goes back to 1846 in the encyclical that year published by Pope Pius IX. And that was the start of a 32-year pontificate that went from 1846 to 1878, called Qui Pluribus, published in 1846. That predicted so much of the horrific stuff that would happen under communism, from the attack on property and religion, even to the family. In fact, Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, "Abolition of the family!" exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. That's verbatim, actually says that in the Communist Manifesto. And so the Catholic Church was warning about this in encyclicals in 1846 for a Communist Manifesto that was published 2 years later, 1848. I also quote in the book a letter between Marx and Engels, where Engels refers to it as the Communist Confession of Faith. He says to Marx, "Give a little more thought to the Communist Confession of Faith. I think we should drop the catechetical form and simply call it the Manifesto, the Communist Manifesto." So that's the name that stuck. That's the name that they ended up with. So point 3. Is this strictly about Marx? No, it's not. It's about much more than Marx. It's about Marxism in general. It's about communism in general, about Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Mao, Pol Pot, Castro, the Frankfurt School, all these different characters, Marcuse, you name it. Key issues, part 4. Here I have 4 key issues. 1, Marx's personal life, which I talked about a little bit with his daughters. Also with the way that he treated his wife, the people around him, was terrible. I mean, Marx, both his wife and his mother, expressed the wish that Karl would start earning some capital, right, rather than just writing about capital. Some of this stuff, people listening will know, was covered by Paul Johnson in his book Intellectuals, the chapter on Marx. Marx was a mooch, a miser, refused to work, refused to bathe, refused to groom, was plagued by boils and carbuncles. I'm going through and reading some of the old medical reports by Marx's doctors who are confounded at why Marx is the only one in his household that's like plagued by these boils that are so bad that the guy has to lay on his side. And by the way, they're at their oozing worst when he's writing Das Kapital, which probably explains why it was such an oozing, nasty work, such an angry work. Marx even said, "I hope the bourgeoisie, if they'll remember anything about me, will remember my carbuncles," right? But his doctors are trying to figure out, I don't understand why Marx is suffering from all these warts and carbuncles and boils. Hey, doc, I got an idea. Guy doesn't bathe. The guy doesn't take a bath. He doesn't clean himself. It's not rocket science here, man. I mean, gee, you got to be a doctor to figure that one out. But Marx was a slob. He got all of his money from his parents when his parents had to finally cut him off. When his dad died, by the way, his dad referred, I quote a March 2nd, 1837 letter from his father, where he asked Karl, he says, that heart of yours, it's very unsettled. Is it a heart possessed? Is it a heart governed by a demon? And if so, is that demon Faustian? So you have all these people in the life of Marx who say, oh yeah, he'd be chanting the words of Faust. He has like a wet eyes, like a wet goblin, right? All this, my little demon, my wicked knave. His wife referring to him that way. His son referring to him that way. Engels, and I have a chapter with this title, referred to Marx as the monster of 10,000 devils. The monster of 10,000 devils, right? As if a monster of it's just crazy stuff. But Marx's personal life, he refused to earn a living. mooched all of his money from his family. When his father died, he went to his mother to get more money from her. And when the old hag wouldn't give him any money, he said, "To hell with her." And that was it. He had it with his mother. And there's such great irony in Marx and Engels in their stupid book, The Communist Manifesto, calling for, in point 3 of their 10-point plan, abolition of all right of inheritance. How hypocritical can that be? These guys lived off of their inheritance. In fact, they lived off of Engels' father's money. If it wasn't for that, they wouldn't have had any money at all. Marx got the family nursemaid, Lenchen, pregnant behind his wife's back. Marx didn't pay Lenchen a dime. In fact, Lenchen had grown up with Marx's wife, Jenny. She was like a sister to Jenny. She had been the nursemaid, this poor working class girl in the Marx household, in Jenny's family's household. So Jenny's family lent Jenny, who became like a bond slave or servant to the Marx family, lent her out to Marx's family. Marx refused to pay her a penny. And then when he got Jenny pregnant, or when got Lenchen pregnant behind Jenny's back, he refused to acknowledge that the child was his and refused to pay the child a penny of child support. In fact, the child became named Freddie, named after Friedrich Engels. So Engels accepted responsibility and paternity for that. Engels didn't care what people thought of his reputation. He refused to get married. He refused to marry any of the women that he lived with. And he didn't care what neither Marx or Engels believed in family. Blessed is he who has no family, was what Marx wrote to Engels. And Marx wrote to one of his would-be son-in-laws, the gorilla. He wrote to him that only an idiot, only a fool would choose marriage. Why would you want to do this? So another thing here, feminists, Marxist feminists, Angela Davis and some of these others. Angela Davis, I mean, come on, Angela. You're black and a woman. You're a feminist. Marx was a misogynist. He was a racist. Give me a break, right? I mean, maybe call yourself a communist. Why would you call yourself a Marxist of all things? Another key issue in this book, and I'm watching the clock here. So Marx's personal life, Marx's bigotry, his anti-Semitism, his racism, and two others that I wanted to note: Marx's belief in abolition, and a fourth, criticism. Marx was all about abolition, abolition, abolition. Abolition of the family, abolition of private property, as he and Engels put it in the manifesto, abolition of all religion and all morality. In fact, they write in the Communist Manifesto, the entire communist theory may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. One of Marx's admiring biographers, Francis Wien, says, "Well, it's ludicrous to blame Marx for the gulags and for all the death and destruction. Really, if you come up with a philosophy whose entire essence is the entire thing may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property, I mean, you're gonna need guns and gulags to take away people's private property. I mean, this is Pope Benedict XVI and John Paul II said Marx's main failure wasn't even an economic one; it was anthropological. It's a failure to understand human nature, among other things. I mean, you try to take away people's private property, you're gonna have a bloodbath on your hands. And this is a basic right, a fundamental right, a natural right. Judeo-Christian law, from the cave to the courthouse, thou shalt not steal. I mean, you want to abolish private property, you're going to have, World War III million on your, 3 billion on your hands. I mean, you're going to need guns and gulags. In fact, Marx and Engels, after the 10-point plan, or they're at the 10-point plan, which calls for abolition of private property, abolition of all right of inheritance, progressive income tax, and so forth. Marx and Engels write, of course, in order to do this, despotic inroads will be necessary. Yeah, you're going to need despotism. So they were all about abolition. They were all about criticism. And this gets back to Marx on religion. Marx, in an 1843 letter to Arnold Rouge, called for the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. In his Opiate of the Masses essay, he uses the word criticism 29 times. He refers to religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. Religion is the opiate of the masses. And he says there in that essay, the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. Marx called for, this is fascinating. In fact, it's at the very end of the Communist Manifesto. And I'll give you this line because I think this is probably, this may be maybe the most important line in the Communist Manifesto. Everybody remembers the end of the manifesto, right? Workers of the world unite, throw off your chains. You've got nothing but your chains to lose. Everybody forgets about this. They write in the manifesto, they write this. They call for the abolition of the present state of things, right? Professors at IWP, if you had a student who turned in a term paper, Professor, I'm going to argue here for the abolition of the present state of things, right? F, right? Abolition of the present state of things. But in the end of the manifesto, they wrote, the communists, openly declare that their ends can be attained only by, are you ready for this? The forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, right? They called for the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. I mean, if you're writing anything today, you say something like, we need to change the current social conditions that are causing harm in society. It was something like that, right? You imagine calling for the forcible overthrow of all existing social I mean, these guys were the extremists. Now, this is really a totally totalitarian ideology of complete and utter fundamental transformation. They say also at the close of the manifesto, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And here's my favorite. Marx had a favorite quote from Goethe's Faust. In fact, it comes from the Mephistopheles, the devil demon character in Goethe's Faust. Friends said that you could hear Marx chanting this line as well as reciting the line. And what was the line? Here it is. You got your notepads out? Everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. That's Karl Marx. That's Karl Marx. Payne and others have said this. When you hear people say, "Oh, Marxism," you young people, Marxism's really all about sharing and being kind to your neighbor. Love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Yeah. No. You want a credo for Marxism? Marx gives it to you. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Marx wanted to burn down the house. And he would stand there in the flaming embers, fist in the air, right? Right now, I am ready anew to begin the revolution. This is not a kind, loving ideology. This is the ideology that wants to burn down the house. Criticism, 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 abolition, abolition, abolition. Which brings me to my fifth and final point. I'm at 40 minutes, so I should stop with this. Why do we need to know this stuff? For the reasons that I just went through. And when you have so many young people today saying positive things about communism, positive things about socialism, and Marx and Engels taught, according to Marxism-Leninism, history would travel through this dialectical stage, this series of stages, from slavery and feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. So socialism was the final transitionary step to communism. That socialism was to lead you to communism. That was the whole point of this. Marion Smith of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. so that he likes to say the difference between communism and socialism, just as Christians aspire to heaven, socialists aspire to communism, right? And Pope Benedict XVI said, communism is like their New Jerusalem, their heaven on earth, right? But they're heaven without God. But there's a very religious-like aspiration for these people. Ronald Reagan said, communism, that religion of theirs. So I think why people today, young people today, who are saying positive things about communism. A recent survey, a third of millennials said that they favor abolition of private property. Large numbers of people saying, just very disturbing numbers of people favoring socialism, favoring communism, saying they would vote for a socialist for president. My favorite study a few years back, this was done by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It was, I think, 30% of millennials and 28% of all Americans, 28% of all Americans believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Joseph Stalin. That's insane. That's insane. That's crazy. Why do young people believe this stuff? Because they're ignorant. They don't know this stuff. They won't read books like this. I hear all the time, Communist Manifesto is a pretty good book if you just read it. That's easy, you guys. Just say, oh yeah, have you read it? They haven't read it. They haven't read it. Because if they came to things like abolition of all right of inheritance, abolition of all private property, abolition of the family, abolition of all morality, all religion, they wouldn't buy in any of that. In fact, they're sitting there with their computers and their Starbucks and tell them, hey, dude, you don't get to inherit any of your parents' money that they're going to leave you. Abolition of all right inheritance, that's Marx, right? They'd have second thoughts. So that's why I think they need to know things like this, read books like this in order to be informed, because they're supporting socialism, they're supporting communism because they're ignorant of it. They don't know any better. All right, I'll stop there and I'll take any questions that you have. I think we got about 18 minutes left.
Yeah. So thank you for your remarks. We do have a few questions coming in. The first question, I believe you touched on it a little bit in your remarks, but what inspired you to study Karl Marx and Marxism?
Well, it's a long story, but I was, when I was Hannah's age, so I was an undergrad in college, although Hannah's probably a grad student, but I was at University of Pittsburgh. I was a senior, 1989, 1990, and I was actually pre-med. I was pre-med. I worked for the organ transplant team at the University of Pittsburgh, of all things. And so that was going to be my career. That's what I was going to go into. But I became very interested in communism, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. All of that happened my senior year. In fact, my fall semester in my senior year was the fall of communism, the fall of 1989. And I became really interested in the events going on around me. I was completely apolitical, Hannah. I was non-ideological. I didn't know what a Republican was, what a Democrat was. But I became fascinated by these different events. And I became fascinated at the roles of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, Solidarity Movement, what was going on in Poland. And I just dove into this stuff as a science major, almost like somebody, with test tubes, right? Very objective. Yeah, I had no axe to grind. I had no previous biases. And I was fascinated too by these people on campus called liberals who, the first column that I wrote a letter to the editor of the student newspaper, the Pitt News, which published daily. It's a daily newspaper, Monday through Thursday. And it was defending Reagan's decision to arm the Contras, which to me just made complete sense. And I got called a Nazi, of all things, for that. Nazi, right? A Nazi. I'm thinking, why are they calling me a Nazi? I remember telling this to my dad. I'm like, Dad, I got called a Nazi. He's like, a Nazi? And I said, yeah. He said, what are you writing about, Hitler? I said, no, I'm not writing about it. I wrote this letter to the editor, and the guy published it, and as a column, it was about arming the Contras. And I said, and the other thing, Dad, I had written a second column on on why the homeless problem shouldn't be blamed on Reagan. Right? Again, I did this as like a science major, and for that I got called racist for the first time in my life. Right? And it's like, well, what does this have to do with race? And I just learned then and there that, and in fact, maybe my critics should have learned too, that when you attack me with these things, it just makes me angrier. And so I ended up becoming editorial page editor of the student newspaper. So here I was a pre-med major, writing editorials, columns for the student newspaper on all this stuff in the year 1989, 1990. And I eventually picked up my bachelor's degree in political science, applied to graduate schools, went to Washington, the School of International Service at American University, got my master's there, went on and got my PhD, and this became my field of study. And really beginning with, as John Lenchowski and others know, the study of the role of Ronald Reagan in the collapse of communism. And then that led to John Paul II as well. I did a book called A Pope and a President, which I talked about at IWP. And so this became a kind of lifelong subject. And also too, I read the Communist Manifesto for the first time once I was completely done with all my schooling. Never actually read it in college, just like you could be a poli-sci major and never read the Constitution. I know kids who have gone to law school and have not read the Constitution. So you could learn about Marxism and never actually read Marx. Michael Knowles wrote the foreword to this book, and he quotes Ronald Reagan, who said something like, a communist is somebody who reads Marx, and anti-communist is somebody who understands Marx. Right. Although I think a lot of pro-communists have never even actually read Marx. I think if you just read Marx, you'll become an anti-communist. I don't know how anybody reads this drivel and walks away from it thinking, "Oh, this is good stuff," right? Oh, that absolutely baffles me. I mean, you read it, and it's like reading Herbert Marcuse and some other people. You read this stuff, and you're like, "This is the work of madmen. How could anybody believe any of this?" Right? Shame on you if you take any of this serious. I don't see how you could blame it on somebody's youth or anything. It's just self-contradictory, impossible, impractical nonsense from the very beginning. I don't know how anybody reads this stuff and comes away from it supporting it. Doesn't make any sense to me.
My next question kind of goes along with the last point that you made. How can we fight against cultural Marxism seeping into our culture?
Well, it's a good question, and that's where a lot of the Marxism is being applied today to culture. And I wrote a couple pieces on this for American Spectator: Cultural Marxism and Its Conspirators, Part One and Part Two. I mean, you could search the word cultural Marxism on Google, and what pops up is white nationalist anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which again shows how what a problem big tech is. You've got some, I don't know, 14-year-old writing the little definitions for Google on what cultural Marxism means. I mean, if you think that that's what cultural Marxism is, I mean, you're unbelievably lazy. I mean, that is absurd. Read Gramsci, uh, uh, read Max Horkheimer, read any of these early people from the Frankfurt School. Read Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was a sexual Marxist. He was trying to create a unified field of Freudianism, Marxism. He literally coined the term and wrote the book, The Sexual Revolution. Kate Millett wrote Sexual Politics. I have on my desk at home Patrisse Cullors, the founder of Black Lives Matter, her memoirs with the intro from Angela Davis. And Angela Davis uses the word comrades like 4 or 5 times in the first 4 or 5 paragraphs to describe Patrisse. They're applying their Marxism to cultural, gender, sexuality, and even racial stuff, which is really weird because Marxism was originally intended to be applied to economics, class, wealth redistribution. But if you go to the website today of People's World, the About section, they issue a call for what they call cultural workers, of all things. So, they're dabbling in culture That's where they are. They're in the area of culture more than they are even economics. That's where the battle is being waged by so many of today's modern Marxists.
The next question I have, does this more diabolical element of communism persist, manifest differently in societies that don't have strong Christian backgrounds like China or North Korea?
Well, unfortunately, no. As some of the places where Marxism has had its greatest success has been in religious countries. In fact, I find it chillingly ironic that it was the Congress of Vienna, 1815, that Tsar Alexander called for his Holy Alliance to try to get nations to incorporate the principles of Christianity into the way they conduct relations with one another. And 100 years later, it was that nation of Russia, of the Russian Orthodox Church, that became the headquarters, the home of the global communist revolution, of all things. Probably the most religious country in the Western Hemisphere over the last 60, 70 to 100 years, other than the United States, was Cuba. And look at the war on religion there. People will find this really stunning, but it's true. Uh, Pyongyang was once known as the Jerusalem of the East. Pyongyang, of all things. So North Korea, that area, that region was very, very religious. Uh, it, some of the countries that have best resisted communism have done so because of their religious patrimony, such as, for example, Poland, right? Marx country. In fact, really the key there, above all, was the force of religion and the church. But otherwise, and I think this is kind of a reflection, Hannah, of another kind of insidious, diabolical aspect of communism. It's that it slithers into these religious countries and religious societies. If I may get religious about this, right? It's as if the devil looks and says, that's the country that I want. I want that one, right? It leaves alone a country that's already without God, without religion, and where people are maybe practicing voodoo or whatever else. He says, no, I want Cuba, right? I want that head on my platter, right? That's the country that I want. That's the country that I'm going after. North Korea, Pyongyang, that's the one that I want.
This My next question. I know you kind of mentioned there was religious undertones kind of with Marx and how he grew up in that sense. Would you say that Marx's ideology was a sort of religion? And do you think that he hijacked any key themes from Christianity to create this kind of false religion?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, yeah. In fact, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Right. I mean, that's a twisting and perversion of a verse from Scripture. In fact, I'm gonna mess it up, but the actual Scripture verse is from each according to his abilities, each according to his from. Yeah, I'm getting it wrong, but look it up. You'll find it. You'll find it right away. It's in the New Testament, and Marx does that a lot. There's a lot of aping of God and aping of religious language. And one of the biggest mistakes that kind of religious left woke Christians say all the time is, well, the communists have, they have a lot of this right. They're doing the gospel pretty well, better than a lot of Christians. No, no. I quote in the book a letter from Dorothy Day's Catholic worker, of all things, which is really well done, where they're rejecting Earl Browder's outstretched hand, Communist Party USA, to Catholics in the 1930s. And Dorothy Day's group, they say, no, 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 no. Look, you may agree with us on wanting to help some workers and wanting to help the poor, but we cannot be communists, right? You have a strictly atheistic, materialistic philosophy that rejects God. In fact, Pope Pius the 11th in Quadragesimo Anno says one cannot at the same time be a Christian and a socialist. And he says, to the extent that communists have anything in common with the gospel, and thus people that want to help the poor have some sympathies toward communism, he says, if you want to help the poor, just practice the Christian gospel, right? Communism has 100 attributes, and 98 of them are insidious. But it's like, Oh, but they want to help the poor. Oh, there's a lot in common here with Christianity, right? No, I mean, it's just, so what? They're wrong on everything else. You don't look at that and say, oh, we got one thing in here they have. There must be a lot in common between communism and Christianity. No, that's really muddled thinking. It's it was strictly a materialistic philosophy. And as Benedict XVI and John Paul II said, man does not live on bread alone. In fact, that's what Christ told Satan, right? Man does not live on bread alone. Augustine said we have a God-shaped vacuum in each of us that only God can fill. It's not a dollar-shaped vacuum in each of us, right? We seek not strictly economic materialism, right? We're hardwired for God. And so for the communists to reject all of that, have their religion wrong, their philosophy wrong, their anthropology wrong, their economics wrong, all of that wrong, right? That's why this ideology has been so destructive.
Thank you. I believe we have time for one more question, and I think this is kind of a good last question. What elements of our culture, besides books, do you feel are effective to rescue that third of U.S. population from the delusions that they've been sold?
Yeah, it's a great way to end. Video, video. Take videos like this and send this to anybody you know who's sympathetic to communism. Have them listen to it. Yeah, they don't have to sit down and read a book. Most people won't sit down and read a book. I did a before I even really knew what it was, Hannah, which I know this is going to sound really bad, but I did a PragerU video, and PragerU videos were already enormously popular. But I did one called something like who was the real Karl Marx. I think this was around 2017, 2016. In fact, they contacted me after I wrote a Wall Street Journal piece on this. So it was before this book came out. And that's like a 3 to 4 minute long video. Man, that thing had 3 million hits between YouTube and the PragerU website within like a couple weeks, like 3 million hits. And I don't even know what it is now. It's probably 5 or 6 million. And so many people, young people in particular, are being educated by getting these 3 to 4 minute video clips. So let's take advantage of big tech, which in many ways is killing us. But let's use platforms like this to try to influence people and teach them and educate them. Educate, educate, educate. And I think platforms like this and what IWP is doing are so crucial to that. I commend you all.
Well, great. Thank you for this very informative talk. Everyone, please go check out Dr. Kengor's book, The Devil and Karl Marx. I would like to thank all of you who joined us here on Zoom and Facebook. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that's iwp.edu. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kengor.
Thank you, Hannah. Take care. God bless.
You too.